Have you ever been at your wit's end? Walls pressing in on you in a situation. It doesn't look like there's any way out. In my last job, I can remember really vividly having one of these moments. I don't know if you've had one. In my last job, I helped start schools. And so people would reach out to my company and they would say, we want to start a school. And so then they would talk to me and I would try to walk them from the point of reaching out to the point of opening day and then beyond. And there was this one particular team, these two ladies, who had all of the energy in the world, all of the talent for it, all of the conviction. But when you're starting a school, there are like 100, maybe 1,000 decisions that you have to make leading up to opening day that are not black and white. And especially with a group like ours where we had a very strong convictions about what we were doing, it was a complicated and difficult process. And I remember with this particular team, hitting July, and at every step along the process, we had questions and indecision and inability to move forward in the process. So by the time we hit July, I'm thinking about opening day in 2 months, about that first day of school, and it did not look at all like we were going to get there. And I'm starting to think about the money that they've put into it. It's going to be wasted. The money we've put into them. The time, the hopes that community had for a great education. And we were careening towards a disaster. You ever been there? Maybe a work situation, maybe a relationship where a person that you are with will not change, but you need them to. Or maybe you've been to the hospital over and over and over again with a particular malady, and the doctors keep on giving you false starts and wrong answers. If you can identify with that feeling at all, then you have a way into our text of Lamentations 5 tonight. We conclude our series on Lamentations in Lamentations 5, meditating on a poem that what it's trying to do for us, what it's going to do for us, is give us a way into that feeling, because that was the predominant feeling of these people in the year 586 BC and after, when Jerusalem had fallen and everything that they knew had crumbled, and they were in a situation that looked like there was no way out. And so our goal tonight as we look at this text is to try to put both of our arms around that feeling so that we can really enter into it, so that when we see how these people responded to that feeling, we'll be utterly surprised by it. And then maybe, by the grace of God, we'll learn to respond in the same way. That's our goal. So the way we're going to do that is that in the first 18 verses, the people of Israel are lamenting their condition. And this is deep, intricate poetry. And so the way we're going to enter it is through 5 snapshots. This poetry has layers and depth. And so it's kind of like one of those images, like if you've ever seen one of those images of a cloud, where when you look at it the first time, it looks like a cloud. And then you keep on staring at it, and now it looks like a face, you know? That's how every single one of these lines works. So to enter it, we're going to do 5 snapshots, and we'll look at what they mean and try to peel it back so that we can enter into the world of this text. So first, look at Lamentations 5:2. It says this: "Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to foreigners." Israel has just experienced the exile. Their promised land, Jerusalem, has been completely and utterly destroyed by Babylon, and many of the people of this nation have been sent off away from their home to serve in slavery. And so they cry out to God, "See our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, to foreigners." And on its face, that's devastating alone. To lose your things and to lose your home. I think of this couple that comes to our food pantry every couple of weeks that are from the Ukraine, and they're refugees. And they've shared with us how they're here because bombs went off miles from their home, away from all of their things, away from their home. They don't have any of it. And now they've ended up in Door County, Wisconsin, of all places. Think about how devastating that would be. And it is devastating, but there's actually a depth here that we need to peel back. They use the word inheritance. And if you heard my sermon on Psalm 127, I highlighted that word there as well, because this word comes up over and over again in the Old Testament. Look at Deuteronomy 4, verses 20 and 21 with me. Moses is talking to the people of Israel here in Deuteronomy and telling them that they're going to go into the promised land, and he says this: "The Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron furnace out of Egypt to be a people of his own inheritance, as you are this day. Furthermore, the Lord was angry with me because of you, and he swore that I should not cross the Jordan and that I should not enter the good land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance." You see in verse 20 and in 21 how he uses this word inheritance twice, but in two different ways. See, what this wordplay is doing in the first place is talking about God's people, Israel, being God's inheritance. But then he also says that the land is their inheritance. And to understand this, we have to know the difference between an inheritance and stuff. You know the difference? You don't put stuff in a lockbox and hand it down through generations, right? An inheritance is something that you deeply treasure and prize, and you love it so much, it's so important to you that you would only give it to someone who you also highly value and treasure. And so what Moses is saying in Deuteronomy is that Israel themselves are God's inheritance. God made Israel for himself because he loves them. Later on in Deuteronomy it says, God loves to love Israel. They're his chosen nation. No other nation has the affection of God like Israel. They're his treasured possession. But not only that, because he loves them so much, he's going to give them a land. But that land for them will then become their treasured possession. They will love that land because it marks out for them how much God loves them. They have this unique relationship with their Creator, and they say, what other nation has a God near to us like we do? And they see that closeness in the very land itself, which constitutes their nationhood, their personality as the people chosen by God. So, when the people of Israel in Lamentations 5 say that our inheritance has been turned over to foreigners and strangers, they're not just saying we've lost our stuff and our homes. They did lose that. But the very indicator that they were God's chosen people, that he loved them above all other nations, all other foreigners, and all over the strangers, had been given to the foreigners and the strangers. And they were left utterly alone. Have you ever had something taken from you that you defined yourself by? So that's the first snapshot. Look at the second in verse 3. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows. Again, how devastating for little boys and girls to have their parents carted off into slavery. For wives to have their husbands taken from them to fend for themselves. But for Israel, this was particularly poignant. Look at Deuteronomy, verses 18. I think 17. Chapter 10, 17 and 18. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. That's who Yahweh is. Yahweh is the God of gods, above all other gods, Lord of lords. And so, because he's God of gods, he surrounds himself with the mighty and the powerful, right? The rich. No, look at verse 18. He executes justice for the fatherless, the orphan, and the widow. He loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. See, the unique character of this God, Yahweh, is that he is the God above all other gods, and yet his utmost compassion and care is for the orphan and the widow. Those most vulnerable are the ones he is most intent on saving. And because this marks out Yahweh's character as particular, the people of Israel looked to this idea to embed in their society that true justice was caring for orphans and widows. What they believed about themselves was that God had chosen to love them and bless them so that they could then be a blessing to those who couldn't help themselves. That was the very nature of their relationship with God, is that it empowered them to be able to help those who needed it the most. So in Lamentations 5, when they say, we have become orphans, our mothers are like widows, they're actually saying, we've become the very people that God said that we would be in a position to provide for. This is what we're supposed to be, the providers of orphans and widows, and now we're orphans and widows. But poetry is so beautiful, it goes another layer deeper. I've included a more literal translation on the screen of Lamentations 5:3, if you go back there. Notice the nouns of Lamentations 5:3. There's orphans, plural. There's mothers, plural. And then there's widows, plural. But after it says we have become orphans, it says in the English Standard Version, fatherless. But a more literal way to render that would be, there is no father. Singular. Why isn't it, there are no fathers? Well, because in the Old Testament, it was blasphemy of the highest order to call any one particular person God's son. But the nation of Israel, as a collective, was God's son. Hosea chapter 11, God pursues his son, Israel. And yet, the author of Lamentation cries out, we're orphans. Where is our father? God had promised through his fatherly and loving care of them to put them in a position to bless orphans and widows, and here they are without God, the husband of Israel, and God, the father of Israel, or it feels that way to them in that moment. Have you ever felt abandoned? Like promises you'd been made to prosper you were not being fulfilled? Third snapshot, verse 6. We have given the hand to Egypt and to Assyria to get bread enough. That expression, give the hand, means to beg, like putting your hand out. And so after the exile, the people of Israel, they scattered. Some got put into slavery and others ran for their lives. And many of them went to Egypt and they put their hands out, kind of like a Charles Dickens character saying, please, sir, give me more. Because they, even though promised to be a people that would have a land overflowing with milk and honey, now they're subsisting off of another nation's wealth. But that phrase, we have given the hand, actually has two meanings. And we have a clue here because it says that we've given the hand to Egypt and to Assyria. But Assyria at this time wasn't a player on the geopolitical scene. They were long gone. So why would they include this name here? Well, the other meaning of the expression give the hand is to put it out for an alliance, to shake hands on it. And what Israel had done in the years leading up to the exile is they had made alliances with both Egypt and Assyria to try to protect themselves. And though they had gone to these foreign nations, as the prophet Jeremiah says, trying to trust in chariots and the might and the power of these foreign nations, it had not helped them at all. And going and putting their trust in false objects of trust, they were now on their knees begging from those same nations that had failed to protect them. See, what the author is doing through double entendre is showing how the decisions that this nation had made had led them to dependence on the very nations they never could rely upon in the first place. Have you ever trusted in someone or something and then became a victim of it? The fourth snapshot is in verse 7. Our fathers sinned and are no more, and we bear their iniquities. The way this the poetry here works in various directions, and in 7, it's building off of verse 6. See, it was a deeply felt conviction for those in Israel that the sins of fathers were borne and carried by their sons. And here Israel is lamenting that their fathers are gone, the ones who were stubborn, who didn't listen, they're gone. And yet here they are, carrying that pain. See, what this immediately makes me think of is 2 Kings chapter 17. So at one time, Israel was one nation under David, but then because of sin, it was split into two. And there was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And in 2 Kings chapter 17, we have this story about the northern king of Israel. He was in an alliance with Assyria, looking for their protection, paying funds to the Assyrians. And one day, he gets the bright idea that he's going to backstab the Assyrian king with the Egyptian king. But the Assyrian king finds out, and the Assyrians come through and wipe the northern kingdom off the map. This is where the expression, the lost tribes of Israel, come from, because the northern kingdom was never reestablished after that exile. But I think our tendency in reading that story would be to say, okay, they made bad political decisions, right? They shouldn't have done that. But this is what the author of 2 Kings 17 says was the cause of their being destroyed. Look at 2 Kings 17, verse 14. This is why they were destroyed. They would not listen, but were stubborn, as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. And then he goes on to summarize in verses 15 through 17 the sins of the fathers. And then in verse 18 says, therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. See, the southern kingdom had seen this happen, and they knew that they bore the guilt of the sins of their fathers. And here they were, helpless, because their sins, stubbornness, their father's stubbornness, they had inherited. And they carried it on them like a weight. And they knew that they deserved it. Have you ever carried the weight of your parents' sin? Have the sins of people in your past who are no longer here deeply affected your present? The fifth snapshot is in verse 8. Slaves rule over us. There is none to deliver us from their hand. Why would Israel call their captors slaves? Well, it was very important to the national story of Israel and their own self-understanding that what had come before them highly defined how they understood who they were and how they related to God, because God had acted in history to make them a nation. And they retell this story really clearly in Judges chapter 6. A prophet comes to Israel and says this in verses 8 and 9. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I led you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery. And I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you and gave you their land. See, before they could go on to fight other battles, they needed to remember who they were, and that is what defined them as a nation. What was the instigating act of them becoming the nation of Israel in the wilderness was that God himself had delivered them from slavery. Being God's people meant that they were free, that they weren't slaves. And not only that, their deliverer was God himself. And yet the poet says, slaves rule over us, and there's no one to deliver us. This people, who had understood themselves as delivered from slavery, with God as their deliverer, were in a situation where it felt like God was nowhere to be found. Have you ever felt like God was nowhere to be found? Look at how the poet summarizes all of their suffering in verse 16a. The crown has fallen from our head. And then most poignant, and the most devastating and the culmination of their suffering in verse 18. Mount Zion lies desolate. Jackals prowl over it. This was the one nation that had God living among them on Mount Zion. His actual presence was on the temple. They had God among them as their king. They could visit him. God's presence was the very thing lost in the garden, and it had been reunited with them when he had chosen to dwell among this people in his house. And now, God's house is so empty that wild, undomesticated animals are prowling about. Everything that Israel believed about themselves has been subverted. Their land that would mark them out as special to God, the presence of God among them, the fatherhood of God, their deliverance from slavery, everything that God had promised in this moment, they don't feel he's delivering. It doesn't look like God is there. It doesn't feel like God is acting. So how do they respond to that? Look at Lamentations 5:16b. Woe to us, for we have sinned. See, if this was one of us, we would say, God, it's your fault. You promised me all of this. You said that you would be there for me. We would blame someone else. They've failed me. They have not kept up their end of the bargain. We would get bitter or we would blame. And yet Israel, when God is nowhere to be found, says, woe to us. We are utterly and totally dependent on God. It may not feel like God is here right now, but we need him to be here. That is our only hope of deliverance. There is nothing else. And so, with remarkable words of hope, this is what they say in verses 19 through 22. You, O Lord, reign forever. How can they cling to that? Your throne endures to all generations. Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and you remain exceedingly angry with us. See, what we see in Lamentations 5 is this incredible beauty, in that on the one hand, they are completely aware of their situation. It doesn't feel like God's present. They're utterly dependent upon God. And not only that, verse 22, God has every right to be so angry with them that they could be rejected forever. If that's what's true, they would say, God, you have every right to reject us. We've sinned. We're completely culpable for every disaster that has occurred. This is our fault. We know that. And yet at the same time, they cry out to him and say, but restore us. Renew us as of Ancient of Days. Verse 22 is so bleak that in the traditional Jewish liturgy today, when they read Lamentations 5, they read Lamentations 5:21 and then 22, and then they read 21 again, and then they end. Because 22, they're so honest about their situation. I have to tell you how my story at the beginning resolved itself. So the reason I remember July is because these people called a meeting with my boss. And I remember going into that meeting thinking, this is going to be bad. This is going to be terrible. I don't see any way for this to resolve well. We are headed towards disaster. And I even consciously in my head, I hadn't been talking to my boss about it at all. And so I was like, I could, maybe hedge my bets here and try to save face, but I just decided I'm just not going to say anything. I'm going to go in, see what comes of this. And as we start talking, my boss does what I could never have imagined, that I really never thought was going to be possible, and that is she started answering each of these questions definitively, persuasively, in exactly the same ways that I had been. And I saw on these ladies' faces, as they just softened, they started to understand. Their whole disposition changed. I could never have imagined the situation ending positively. And then something that was completely unimaginably, completely out of my control happened, and I was just utterly thrilled. And a couple months later, the school started with 80 kids on opening day. A pretty remarkable instance. Have you ever experienced one of those reversals of fortune that seemed to be so surprising you could never have made it up? Well, when I consider this tension that they're crying about in Lamentations 5, that they need God utterly, but He has by every right utterly rejected them, it makes me think of a man who, when he was on the cross, cried out words almost exactly like Lamentations 5:20, my Father, why have you forsaken me?" And then God put all of the shame that we deserved, all of the consequences of our sin, all of the suffering that we experience in this world, all of our treachery, all of the horrific things that we've done, He put all of it on His Son. Because He should utterly reject us, He should pour out all of His wrath, but instead He put it on Himself, so that any who call on Him could be restored, so that we could be utterly and totally renewed, made as new creations. So Lamentations 5 teaches us that when you're suffering, look to Jesus. Even when it doesn't look like there's any way out, He is your only hope. Cling to Him. Put all of your faith in Him. It's for that reason that we celebrate communion.